Hello, 7th graders. This is math lesson 1-8 with your best friend, Miss Uhas, talking to you about properties. And I just want to point out that, whoops, I don't know why that's moving around. I just want to point out that I have the puppy here yawning to remind you to stay awake during this lesson. Don't fall asleep. We're actually going through some very important stuff buried in some of the less interesting things. So let's stay awake. The focus is 4 specific properties: the distributive property, the commutative property, associative properties, and identity properties. And before I go anywhere else, I want to see if I can get the pointer to work here. Do I have a laser pointer here? Check it out. I got a little red ball. Okay, distributive property is the most important one to learn today. You may have been introduced to it last year. I'm not sure if you were or not. I don't remember. This property has to be mastered. Commutative, associative, and identity you need to learn to recognize so that you can simplify algebraic expressions and make your job easier. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about the distributive property? That's when you see a situation that looks kind of like this. That would be 3, open parentheses, 4 plus 6, close parentheses. And they ask you to simplify that. And what they're asking you to do is take the number that is outside the parentheses and multiply it by each of the numbers inside the parentheses. So let's take a look at the solution distributive property for this one. So that would be 3 times 4 plus 3 times 6. That's what the distributive property looks like. And the reason that it is a plus sign between these two expressions is because there is a plus sign between the 4 and the 6 in the parentheses. So one of the things you're going to be asked to do today is rewrite expressions using the distributive property, and they want you to practice with numbers that are easy to work with first so that when we start using variables you don't get confused. More on that later. Let's talk about commutative properties. Let me take a second and erase here. I hope you wrote that down in your notes. Commutative properties are simply talking about the fact that when you add or multiply, the order that you add or multiply in does not matter. So in other words, with a commutative property, 4 plus 12 is going to be equal to 12 plus 4. The other thing you're going to notice is that 4 times 12 is going to be equal to 12 times 4. The commutative property says it doesn't matter what order you add or multiply in, you will still get the same answer. Associative properties are a little bit more complicated. Associative properties are about grouping. Associative properties are basically saying that it doesn't matter what order you group numbers in when adding or subtracting. So in other words, you could say that 3 times 4 times 5 is going to give you the same result as parentheses 3 times 4 times 5. Those are associative properties. In the same way, and I'm going to work down here for a second, you can say that 3 plus 4 plus 5 is going to give you the same answer as open parentheses 3 plus 4 plus 5. All we're doing is moving the parentheses. That's what makes it associative. Okay, final property to talk about, and that is identity properties. And you're going to love these because they're something that you've learned about since you were in probably 3rd grade when you were first learning how to multiply. Identity properties are simply saying that when you use certain operations with numbers, you always end up with the number that you started with. For example, 1 plus 0 is equal to 1. Since you end up with the 1 that you started with, this is an identity property. Any number that you add 0 to, you're going to end up with that number. In the same way, if you take any number and you multiply it by 1, you are going to end up with the same number. that is also an identity property because you started with the 2 here and you ended up with the 2. Okay, let's do some practice so I can actually show you why learning these properties is useful. Let's start with the distributive property. Let me give you an example of a problem that you are going to be asked to solve. Let's say that you have the problem, and we're going to start something really easy here. 7, open parentheses, 4 plus 3. And the direction that you're being given is use the distributive property to rewrite the expression, then evaluate it. This is what they want you to do. The first thing you have to do is rewrite the expression using the property. So you would take the 7 and multiply it by the 4, and then you would take the 7 and multiply it by the 3. So what you would write would be 7 times 4. You're going to add, because it's 4 plus 3, and then 7 times 3. That's the first thing they're asking you to do, and yes, you do have to do that. The second thing you're asking you to do is actually evaluate the expression. So you get out your calculator and you figure out that 7 times 4 is 28, and 7 times 3 is 21, and therefore the solution to this problem is 49. The reason that's important is because eventually you are going to be working with algebraic expressions, and here's an example of one. Let's say you got the problem 2, open parentheses, x plus 3. Stop the video, and what I want you to do is use the distributive property to rewrite the expression. Do that now. Let's see how you did. Hopefully the first thing you did is rewrote it with the number on the outside multiplied by the first number inside the parentheses. That is going to be 2x, which means 2 times x. Then you're going to add, because you're adding the x plus 3. And then you take the 2 and multiply it times the 3 for 2 times 3. Obviously, when you simplify this, you're going to get 2x plus 6. And you're done. That's as far as you go with the distributive property in a problem like that because you don't know what x is yet. Okay, let's move on to figuring out why the other properties are useful. The reason the other properties are useful is because you can use them to mentally solve problems faster. Let me give you an example of this. Let us say that you got the problem 89 plus 15 plus 1. And you were asked to solve this problem in your head. I don't know about you, I would have some trouble solving this problem in my head. So the direction that you're given is to use properties in order to simplify this problem. What I see is that the 89 and the 1 can be added together just as easily as the 89 and the 15. According to the commutative property, it doesn't matter what order you add things in. And according to the associative property, it doesn't really matter how you group things as long as all you're doing is adding. 89 plus 1 is 90. So mentally, I can very easily figure out what 90 plus 15 is in my head, much easier than 89 plus 15 plus 1. That's why you do that. Okay, let's see if we can find another problem that is just like this. Let's say you're given the problem 15 times 8 times 2. And you're being asked to solve that problem mentally. Again, I don't know about you, but I think I would have a problem figuring that out in my head. I'm not entirely sure what 15 times 16 is. But thanks to the associative property, I can regroup these numbers. And what I would do is I would take the 15 and I would multiply it by the 2 and then multiply that number by 8. 15 times 2 is 30. And 30 times 8 is simply 8 times 3, which is 24, and then add a 0. And that is much easier to solve mentally. So that is the point of this lesson. Yes, you could get out a calculator and figure these out, but it is better practice for you if you try to figure these problems out in your head. All right, so this was a pretty easy lesson. Definitely it will get more challenging. What you've really got to do is focus on mastering the distributive property. We are going to be doing a lot of practice with that. That's all I have for you guys. Good night.